Hello, everyone. You don't know about me, but I bet you want to. My name is Katie Klein. I'm an English instructor at Kansas State University, and as you can see, I'm prone to inserting Taylor Swift lyrics into everyday life. While I received my master's in children's literature from K-State in 2020, I've been unofficially studying Taylor Swift since I was about 12 years old. And like any good academic, I had to find a way to incorporate my passions with my job. Over time, one thing I've noticed is how often cars and driving appear in Taylor Swift songs. We'll get into exactly how often that is in just a minute, but trust me when I say it's a lot. I've been working on this particular presentation for about 2.5 years now, between pandemics canceling conferences and, Taylor Swift keep releasing more albums. I just haven't had time to get it all tied up. But thankfully, there have been no surprise albums dropped this week. Of course, now that I'm giving this presentation, we're due for one just about any day now, and it'll probably undo everything I've done, as it goes. Right now, what you're watching is kind of a separate run of the talk I actually gave at PCA. And let's call this I'll Drive, Freedom in Driving and the Lyrics of Taylor Swift, Katie's version. Are you ready for it? If you're watching this, I imagine you've at least heard of Taylor Swift. It's kind of hard not to. She's released 10 studio albums in the last 15 years, with the latest Fearless Taylor's version, a re-recording of her sophomore album, dropping just under 2 months ago with an additional 6 bonus tracks. She's won over 300 awards, and she's literally receiving more each week. For example, she's set to receive the NMPA's Songwriter Icon Award on June 9th, next Friday. Among her other accolades are 11 Grammys, 3 for Album of the Year, 25 Billboard Music Awards, and 32 American Music Awards, including 2019's Artist of the Decade honor. Outside of music, Swift was named one of Time Magazine's Silence Breakers, who collectively received the 2017 Person of the Year honor for bringing attention to sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. She's also the first woman to win the Brits Icon Award. She has an eponymous BMI award named after her. So she's won a few things. She's lent her voice to 7 movie soundtracks, and she collaborated with composer Andrew Lloyd Webber to write the new original song, Beautiful Ghosts, which appeared in the 2019 adaptation of Webber's musical Cats, which, say what you will about the movie Cats, but Taylor Swift worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber, so props to her. She's made 12 TV and movie appearances, both as herself and as scripted fictional characters. And in January 2020, she released her documentary Miss Americana on Netflix, which went on to win a Rotten Tomatoes Golden Tomato Award for Fan Favorite Movie. And as I've mentioned, her songs also mention driving quite a lot. Now, how often is a lot, Katie? I'm so glad you've asked. Just enjoy this. So you got all that, right? It's okay if not. In the link to this video, in the comments, in the description, that's what I'm looking for. In the description of this video, I will link you to a document that has a comprehensive list of every Taylor Swift lyric that references cars or driving. And I will also include a link to a Spotify playlist that has all of those songs on it in case you're inclined to listen. But I've also written them down here for you. So she mentions ride or riding 10 times. She mentions car 30 times. Other vehicles like trucks, taxis, and trains get brought up 16 times. Variations of the word driving appear 24 times. Specific car parts like headlights, tires, and rear view mirrors are mentioned 9 times. Road is used either literally or metaphorically 16 times. And she uses the driving language of pulled up twice. And she mentions a license once. So for all of those whose math skills don't really extend beyond knowing that Taylor Swift has songs called 15, 22, and 7, that's 108 references to cars and driving that, for the most part, don't include repeated lines like choruses or pre-choruses. So, like I said, she mentions driving a lot. So, why driving? Why does it matter? Why do we care? If we apply the historical context of freedom and driving to Taylor Swift's lyrics, we can see a young woman navigating her place in this world through music, and her massive fan base is along for the ride. Swift's transition from passenger to driver over the course of her discography reflects her personal and professional growth and prompts listeners to take control of their own lives and careers. But let's get a little bit of context. Here is just a brief look into the historical connection between women and driving, specifically in the United States, since Swift is an American singer. So there's a long engendered relationship between women and driving, which dates back to the invention of the car and even before. But women in driving hit a unique snag in World War I. Once most of the men in the US were sent off to war, companies had to shift their target audience for their traditionally masculine products from men to women in order to stay in business. Basically, if women didn't buy it, it didn't get bought. And cars were one of those masculine products. According to E. Michelle Ramsey, quote, advertisers used abstract notions of freedom to encourage women to buy automobiles. These World War I era ads, quote, conflated driving in public with admission into the traditional public sphere and consumption with liberation. And pay attention to those words that I've got bolded in blue here because they're going to come up again later. Long story short, it was a bad time for women in driving, even if we can only recognize this in retrospect. Ramsey points out that World War I era car ads, quote, did not attempt to represent reality, rather they represented particular and usually impossible aspirations for women. Women were basically a stand-in target audience for companies until the real audience, men, returned home from war. But the problem is that once women got a taste of driving and the freedom that it brought them, they didn't want to give it up. By 1937, around 72% of girls living on farms were interested in driving, but only about 35% of them had the ability to drive or the access to learn how. Meanwhile, 72% of boys who were living on farms were driving. So the TLDR takeaway of that is that it was social pressures and expectations that kept women and girls from driving more so than a lack of interest or anything physical or inherent about women. And that is going to be important when we get back to Taylor Swift in just a minute. I do want to note that this complicated relationship between women and driving isn't a 20th century problem that had its moment and then was addressed later. At least not everywhere. The issue of women's right to drive continued even a century after these ads were published. So on June 24th, 2018, yes, you are reading that right, only 3 years ago, women became legally allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. This makes Saudi Arabia the last country in the world to finally lift the ban on women driving. In a 2019 article, freelance Saudi journalist Lula Shaloub wrote that she has, quote, never felt as empowered and independent as when the ban was lifted, and that driving, quote, allows women to assert a modicum of individuality and freedom of choice. A female Saudi taxi driver was also interviewed, and she was quoted as saying that she, quote, felt safe on the road and in control. So note again those words in blue: individuality, freedom, safe, in control. These are the same kinds of words that we saw being used to discuss those ads from 100 years prior. So what we see here is this persistence of freedom and driving and its connection to women and the feelings of independence that it brings them. Now for the $400 million question. Where does Taylor Swift fit into this narrative? So here I have pulled a selection of lyrics from the 108 references that I breezed through earlier. These come from across Taylor's discography, and I've highlighted the lyrics that specifically pertain to both riding and driving. But there's still a lot going on here, so let's just focus on the lyrics where the narrator isn't driving. Now, for all of my English scholars in the audience, and especially you poets, I know you're out there, we will have to have that conversation about author versus narrator, or in this case, songwriter versus narrator. So Taylor Swift is known for writing her own lyrics. She has written or co-written every song on all of her albums, and she wrote her third album, Speak Now, entirely by herself. So she has a lot of say in her lyrics, a lot of control over those things. And if you are prone to scanning the headlines of tabloids while you're in line at Walmart like I am, you probably also know that she has more infamously been criticized for writing about her romantic relationships, for naming her love interests in her songs, and for being overly personal. And for those two reasons, I feel comfortable saying that we can, in this special Taylor Swift circumstance, assume that the songwriter and the narrator are to an extent the same person in most of her songs. So with that assumption in mind, let's look at these words that I have circled. There are 3 instances where Swift references riding and the passenger side, and 3 instances where she makes it clear that a second person is driving. And for context, in these 3 particular instances here, that second person is a love interest who is presumably male. And since I've been told that not every person who sees this talk will have spent the last 15 years preparing by memorizing all of Taylor Swift's discography, I've laid these lyrics out onto a timeline for us. Please also note those blue asterisks on the last 4 albums, because those designate albums that Taylor Swift owns the master's recordings to and just the rights. Her first 6 albums are owned by Big Machine Records, her former label, meaning that they're the ones who will directly profit from the purchasing, streaming, and performances of these songs. And we can kind of go into why that's a problem, because there was a whole issue when Big Machine was bought out by Scooter Braun, and Taylor was never given the opportunity to own her own intellectual property. And to put it nicely, she and Scooter Braun have creative differences in artists' rights. So, not a particular fan of Scooter Braun and not particularly interested in him profiting off of Taylor Swift's life's work. And that is why we have the re-recordings coming. It's an effort from Taylor Swift to reclaim her intellectual property and to kind of speak up for artists who are in situations with abusive or just kind of icky record labels. So there's a lot going into this, and there's a lot to of personal and music industry stuff to understand when it comes to her not owning those first 6 albums and what the implications of that are. And we can have a longer chat about that if we need to. But what we want to focus on here is that all of these not driving lyrics seem to be concentrated on albums she doesn't own. So now let's look at her driving lyrics. I want to focus specifically on that I pronoun, and I've circled moments where that occurs and laid them out onto the same timeline as before. When I practiced this session originally, I could go on for 8.5, 10 minutes just on this slide alone, breaking down every single lyric. I'm not going to do that. I will do a quick run through. If you're watching this, reach out, send me a text or a tweet or a Facebook message, and I'm happy to talk with you more about the different lyrics and like my hypotheses behind certain behaviors and that kind of thing. But for now, I'll just kind of do a quick run through for you. So Taylor Swift signed as a songwriter with Sony when she was 13 years old. She released her debut album at 16. She released Fearless when she was 18 in 2008. And that album went on to win Album of the Year at the 2010 Grammys. And at that point, she was the youngest woman to ever win that award. So for a teenager, that is an awful lot of freedom and control over your career, which is why I think we see these driving lyrics on the early albums. She's feeling like she's in control. She's going toward those dreams. It feels really, really good. Now we get into a phase where I see Swift kind of introducing implied images of driving. And if we take just a second to look at Speak Now, you see on the timeline I've written exclusively references to being a passenger or someone else driving. I can't say exactly why this is. I was not in Taylor Swift's head, but remember that she wrote Speak Now entirely by herself. Speak Now, by this point, she is a name. She's won Album of the Year. She's headlined her first world tour with Fearless, and now people know who she is. This is also the time in her life where people started speculating about her dating life. There were magazines writing things about her, who she's presumably dating, how she dates too much, how she's only dated somebody for 2 months before they broke up. She's starting to have things said about her that she can't control. She doesn't have any say in what these people are saying. So you would think if anywhere we were going to see her take control, it would be in her songwriting. But what kind of my argument is that her songwriting is reflective of where she sees herself in this world, both personally and professionally. And with no references to her driving on Speak Now, we can get the impression that she doesn't feel like she has as much control as she did previously, that illusion has disappeared to an extent. By her fourth album, Red, we are getting those implied driving images in earnest. So what that means is we get the impression that she does drive or she's supposed to be driving, but there's not that punchiness of that explicit I pronoun that we saw earlier. Images of driving are like cloaked in simile, such as loving him is like driving a new Maserati down a dead-end street, or she's seen near a car but never behind the wheel, such as the lyrics, "We walked down the block to my car, I almost brought him up." That's from the song Begin Again. We can talk about reputation and the joke that Harry Styles is a bad driver. That's always a fun conversation. I'm sorry, that's the album 1989. We can talk about it 1989 and the jokes that Harry Styles is a bad driver. But I want to move on to her sixth studio album, Reputation. Getaway Car is a pivotal moment when thinking about Swift's lyrical relationship to driving. Because as the selected lyrics show, the song's outro consistently places Swift in a getaway car, and all of the verbs here, riding, crying, dying, said goodbye, those are not driving. And with the rhyme scheme, granted, I'm no poet, but with the rhyme scheme, she easily could have used the word driving if that was the clear image she wanted listeners to have. Again, the image of Swift driving away from this relationship in a metaphorical getaway car is simply implied, which suggests that maybe subconsciously Swift wasn't as in control of the situation as she wanted to be. Retrospectively, it's also important to note that Reputation was the last album that Swift recorded under Big Machine Records. So while the song is about a romantic relationship, you also get the impression that Swift is driving away from that label, but we don't physically see it. Since 2019, though, Swift has owned all of her new work thanks to her recording contract with Republic Records. And you could say that having her professional control established in writing has given Swift the confidence to get back in the driver's seat lyrically, too. In the Lover track, I Think He Knows, Swift uses the phrase, "I'll drive," for the first time in 11 years, saying, "Lyrical smile, indigo eyes, hand on my thigh, we can follow the sparks, I'll drive." The fact that this lyric comes at such a landmark moment in Swift's career and after so many personal and professional setbacks feels intentional, like a reclamation of that control over her life, her career, her relationships, etc., etc. In Folklore and Evermore, which you might have heard of as Taylor Swift's surprise 2020 albums, Swift returns to her country music roots and refocuses her songwriting from being personal anecdotes to bigger stories about other people and experiences, both real and fictional. In the album notes for Folklore, Swift writes, "I found myself not only writing my own stories, but also writing about or from the perspective of people I've never met, people I've known, or those I wish I hadn't." While this statement forces us to revisit our author versus narrator conversation from earlier, I still want to look at the evidence. Because even when Swift is mostly acting as an outside narrator, we still see moments of explicit driving, such as the line, "Remember when I pulled up and said, get in the car," from the song August, or moments where it's obviously a female character driving, such as the lines, "She said, James, get in, let's drive," from the song Betty, which is a distinct difference from all the masculine pronouns that we saw on earlier albums. And finally, I want to bring up Taylor Swift's latest album, Fearless Taylor's Version. As I've mentioned, these re-recordings are being released as a way for Swift to reclaim her intellectual property. So they are very similar, both in lyrics, almost identical in lyrics, and very similar in style and production to the original album, because it encourages fans to stream the version she owns. They still get the nostalgia. They still get the album that they've come to know and love, but the proceeds benefit Swift and her as opposed to the record label that has some different values and some issues. But for this new album, Swift also decided to bring 6 tracks out from the vault and release them on this album. So on the track Bye Bye Baby, we actually see the phrase "I drive again" in the lyrics. "I'm driving away, and I guess you could say this is the last time I'll drive this way again." While Swift wrote Bye Bye Baby back during the original Fearless era when she was between 16 and 18, I find it really significant that she didn't release it until now. It didn't make the original cut of the album. We had to wait 13 years for it, for a time where Swift herself could decide to give it to us. There is no other factors or forces acting against her. She could include whatever songs on the album that she wanted to, and so she was able to choose this song for us. So in that way, she has control over the songs she releases, and we can see that she has control in the song itself. So what have we learned about Taylor Swift? Taylor Swift is arguably the biggest pop star of our time, especially if you ask me. She's popular, prolific, critically praised. And studying her music and lyrics, and especially observing how she consciously or unconsciously addresses the female experience, shows scholars how women understand how they fit into today's society in this kind of unconventional but still very accessible and available way. We can also see that the transition from passenger to driver is reflective of Swift taking control of her career, and in turn that inspires her fan base, which is primarily teenage girls, young women who have grown up with her, and members of the LGBTQ+ community, as well as these new generations of up-and-coming artists to take control of their own lives and careers. In this picture, if you don't know who that is Taylor Swift with Olivia Rodrigo. Olivia Rodrigo is a fairly new artist. She just released her debut album, Sour, in May. And she has always said that she is a huge Taylor Swift fan. And when I say that she's inspiring new generations of artists, Olivia Rodrigo's album has songs from that album have taken the top 10 spots on the US Spotify since its release, basically. So she is very popular. She's obviously connecting with listeners. And as a kind of fun anecdote, her big song that kind of took her to the spotlight was her single Driver's License. Not saying that there's any connection, but I think it's like just a fun thing to bring up at this point. But she has always cited Swift as a huge influence on her. And it was because of Taylor Swift's work for artist rights that when Olivia Rodrigo was signing her contracts with her record label, she specifically looked for a record label that would give her the rights to her master's recordings, just like Swift has fought for. So we can see her making a difference, and we can see her inspiring the next generation of musicians to have control over their lives and careers as well. Just a note there, some evidence. Finally, we've also learned that Taylor Swift undeniably, as I just was talking about, has had and continues to have an impact on the music industry. Her songwriting has always been personal, and by tracking when she does and doesn't drive in her discography, and then comparing it to her career path and what's going on in her professional life, it uniquely places Swift into the ongoing narrative of the relationships between women and driving that goes back over a century. So, we've done it. Thank you very, very, very much for listening. I know you don't have to. So thank you for clicking and listening. And again, if you have any questions for me or comments, or just want to talk about Taylor Swift, because I love Taylor Swift and we could talk all day, reach out, email, text, Twitter is my Twitter handles there. If you follow me on any kind of social media, I'm happy to talk to you there. But yes, thank you so, so very much. This is just my very brief works cited for this PowerPoint. There's a full bibliography in that document, which we linked in the video description that I was talking about earlier. So again, thank you all so very much. I'm deeply obsessed with this paper, and I'm so happy that I got to share it with you. So thank you all.